Police! 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 It's 8 minutes past 8, so I'm arresting you on suspicion of being concerned to supply Class A drugs.
He called himself Kilo Chris, a name that said everything about what he did and how much of it. But Christopher Barbosa wasn't your typical street dealer. Operating from Bristol, he became one of the most significant suppliers of cocaine in the southwest of England, quietly moving tens of kilos of Class A drugs while keeping his own name out of the headlines. He didn't carry drugs, he didn't hand them off in car parks, he left that to others. Barbosa ran the show from the shadows, using encrypted phones, trusted couriers, and layers of distance to protect himself. But when the network cracked, it cracked wide open. Barbosa was exposed as a key associate of Roma Hyman, a ruthless drugs boss already serving 26 years. Between them, they supplied over £3 million worth of cocaine, flooding towns across the West Country with product. And when the arrest began, Barbosa did what many at his level tried to do. He ran. Through Europe, via Dubai, across borders. But it wasn't enough. This is the story of a man who built his empire quietly, vanished loudly, and was brought down by relentless police work, encrypted evidence, and a very long memory. Before the encrypted phones and the international manhunt, Christopher Barbosa was just another name moving through Bristol's criminal world. He didn't draw attention to himself. No flashy lifestyle, no wild spending. That wasn't his way. He preferred to keep quiet, operating under the radar while making serious moves behind closed doors. Barbosa wasn't interested in street-level dealing. He stayed out of the direct transactions, choosing instead to manage logistics and relationships. His job was to build the network, not to be seen in it. That approach made him valuable. It also made him hard to trace. His biggest step up came when he connected with Roma Hyman, one of the most established cocaine traffickers in the southwest. Hyman already had strong links to supply routes in London and the Midlands, and was moving large volumes of Class A drugs across the region. Barbosa became one of his key buyers. From that point, his access to product, cash, and contacts grew fast. In just a couple of months, Barbosa arranged purchases of over 40 kilos of cocaine from Hyman. That alone put him in a different league. But he didn't stop there. He worked with other suppliers too, people already under investigation for major drug conspiracies. The Allison brothers in Wiltshire were one example. Alex Mail, another dealer operating out of Somerset, was also part of the web. All of them were connected through encrypted devices, kept distant from the actual supply chain by layers of intermediaries. Barbosa's name rarely came up during local arrests. That was by design. He didn't want to be linked directly to the drugs or the deals. Instead, he used couriers and stash houses to move the product. He relied on people like Robert Dent and James Helly to handle the risky parts: transport, storage, distribution. Dent let Barbosa use his home as a base of operations. Helly moved drugs and cash across the southwest. Both men would later be convicted and jailed. But at the time, they kept Barbosa protected. The use of encrypted technology was key. Barbosa operated through Enquirer using the handle Kilo Chris. It was a system that allowed him to communicate with dealers, buyers, and suppliers without fear of being tracked. For a while, it worked. Enquirer gave him the freedom to manage a wide-reaching operation without leaving much of a footprint. But things were already changing. Law enforcement had launched Operation Venetic, a coordinated move to crack encrypted communications and map out drug networks across the UK. Slowly, pieces of Barbosa's world started to surface. Messages, names, drop locations. His alias was no longer just a screen name, it was evidence. Still, Barbosa didn't panic straight away. He kept his head down, continued buying, and moved money through different channels. His confidence came from how far removed he felt from the chaos on the street. He thought that staying invisible was enough. It wasn't. His digital trail was growing, so were the arrests around him. And when the knock finally came, Barbosa made a choice. He vanished. By the time investigators fully realized what Christopher Barbosa had built, the scale of it was hard to ignore. This wasn't someone playing middleman for a few scattered deals. he'd created a network that fed cocaine into communities across the Southwest with quiet consistency. It wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic, it was steady. And that's what made it effective. Everything Barbosa did relied on separation. He avoided touching the product, he avoided being seen with those doing the groundwork. But at the center of it all, he made the calls that set things in motion. Through encrypted chats, he negotiated prices, arranged drop-offs, and scheduled payments. He was the link between suppliers like Roma Hyman and the dealers putting wraps on the street. The numbers told the story. Over 66 kilos of cocaine were linked to him directly. Police believed the real figure was likely higher. Some shipments were moved in bulk, hidden inside vehicles or passed through trusted runners. Others were broken down and distributed in smaller amounts to maintain flexibility. The goal was always the same: get the drugs in, get the money out. Barbosa operated through layers. On one end were the high-level suppliers, men like Hyman and the Allison brothers, who provided wholesale quantities. On the other were regional couriers and distributors, people Barbosa barely interacted with face-to-face. That distance made it difficult to build a case against him at first. His name wasn't on the packaging, his fingerprints weren't on the cash, but the decisions ran through him. He paid people to take the risks. James Helly transported drugs between safe houses, making drop-offs along mapped routes. Robert Dent's house functioned as a base, a quiet location where product was stored and repackaged before being sent out. Both men took the weight when things started falling apart. But Barbosa kept operating in the background, coordinating from wherever he was. What made the network dangerous wasn't just the amount of drugs being moved, it was how normalized it had become. Deliveries were made like clockwork, payments flowed back to the top with few disruptions. Addicts in towns like Weston-super-Mare, Swindon and Bath were being served by a system that worked more like a business than a gang. While others in the trade relied on fear or reputation, Barbosa relied on control. He knew who to trust. He knew which routes were safest. And he didn't make the same mistakes as others who flaunted their success or posted cryptic messages online. His style was measured, and for a long time, it kept him safe. But the encrypted messages, what he thought were his greatest shield, became the weak point. Operation Venetic began to unravel the web, and Barbosa's handle, Kilo Chris, was no longer anonymous. Police traced deals, drop-offs, and shipments back to his encrypted conversations. Bit by bit, they rebuilt the timeline. Behind the numbers were communities facing the consequences. The drugs Barbosa helped move didn't just end up in dealers' hands. They hit families, schools, and estates already struggling. He may have avoided the street, but the harm passed through him all the same. And as the walls started to close in, he didn't stay to fight it. He made another choice. He disappeared. When Operation Venetic exposed the Enquirer network in 2020, dealers across the UK felt the pressure. Arrests were happening fast. Phones were being decrypted. Barbosa knew what was coming, and unlike many of his associates, he didn't wait to be arrested. He left the country before the full case could land on him. The timing was deliberate. He slipped out before charges were formally filed, moving across borders before warrants could catch up. This wasn't panic, it was preparation. He knew how the system worked, and he used that knowledge to stay ahead of it. His route took him through mainland Europe. Reports suggest he travelled through Spain, Belgium and Germany, avoiding airports where identification checks were tighter. Instead, he used ground transport and temporary accommodations. Fake documents, burner phones and support from criminal contacts helped him stay low. For over a year, he managed to stay just out of reach. But even with planning, Barbosa made a mistake. On his way from Dubai to Barcelona, he passed through Paris. That was where French authorities caught up with him, acting on intelligence shared by the Southwest Regional Organised Crime Unit and the National Crime Agency. He was arrested before boarding his next flight, and just like that, the chase was over. His time in custody wasn't straightforward. Barbosa contested extradition at every turn. Legal challenges, paperwork delays and appeals stretched the process across more than 12 months. But eventually, the decisions went against him. In December 2023, He was flown back to the UK under police escort. By the time he landed, everything had changed. His safe houses had been searched. His couriers had been sentenced. His suppliers, Hyman, Mail, the Allisons, were already serving long jail terms. Barbosa returned to face a case that had been built layer by layer, strengthened by the very technology he had once relied on to stay hidden. Authorities described him as a major player who thought he could outweight the law, but international cooperation made that impossible. His arrest in Paris and return to the UK marked the final chapter in a manhunt that stretched across continents. For detectives, his capture wasn't just about one man. It sent a wider message that high-level criminals, even those who hide behind tech and distance, can still be tracked. That the days of disappearing into another country and hoping the trail goes cold are no longer reliable. And for Barbosa, the run had ended. His freedom was gone. The evidence was stacked, and the courtroom was waiting. When Christopher Barbosa stepped into the courtroom at Bristol Crown Court in early 2025, he wasn't a mystery anymore. His alias, Kyle Creer, had been decoded. His network had collapsed, and the prosecution had built a solid case that linked him to over 66 kilos of cocaine moved across the southwest. What the jury saw wasn't a man caught on the edge of a criminal world. They were shown evidence of someone deeply embedded in it, someone who had used encrypted phones, trusted lieutenants, and a constant layer of separation to keep himself protected. But that distance no longer mattered. The decrypted EncroChat messages removed all doubt. Barbosa had been directing orders, arranging bulk deals, and tracking payments in real time. Prosecutors leaned heavily on those messages. They highlighted how Barbosa communicated with major suppliers like Roma Hyman, whose own case had already been tried. Messages showed discussions about delivery times, quantities, and cash handovers. The scale of the orders, sometimes multiple kilos at once, was impossible to dismiss as low-level dealing. Barbosa was buying product worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it wasn't one-off business. It was routine. The Crown also brought forward evidence from Barbosa's inner circle. Couriers like James Helly and Robert Dent had already been jailed. Their convictions supported the prosecution's narrative. Barbosa was the organizer, the coordinator. He didn't touch the drugs, but he controlled the flow. Dent's house had been used as a safe location. Helly had moved large sums of cash and product, and both had done so under Barbosa's instructions. His defense tried to argue he was no longer active when the EncroChat network fell apart. They claimed he had stepped away, distancing himself from crime. But the timeline didn't support it. Barbosa had continued communicating with contacts even after initial arrests. He was still part of the system, still involved in planning, moving, and profiting. One of the more powerful moments in court came when the prosecution detailed how Barbosa had tried to disappear. They framed his escape through Europe not as fear, but as strategy. It wasn't just about avoiding prison, it was about protecting himself, his assets, and his control. The jury heard all of it, the texts, the scale, the method, and the flight. They saw a man who had built a criminal business with corporate precision, but without any of the oversight or accountability that comes with a legitimate trade. When the verdict came, it was clear. Guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, the encrypted chats, the supplier network, the weight of product moved. None of it could be explained away. Barbosa didn't show much emotion, but the message from the courtroom was loud enough. No more aliases, no more distance. Just the reality of what he'd built and what it had cost. On April 4th, 2025, at Bristol Crown Court, Christopher Barbosa, known to his network as Kyle Chris, was sentenced to 19 years in prison. The judge described him as a central figure in a sophisticated drug supply chain. Not someone pulled into the lifestyle, not someone operating under pressure, but a man who had chosen his place at the top. Barbosa had coordinated the purchase and movement of over 66 kilos of cocaine. He used encrypted tech to manage his orders, sourced kilos at a time, and outsourced the risk to others. It was a business model, one based on exploitation and distance. The court acknowledged his influence in the Southwest drug scene. His reach stretched across counties. His name was linked to multiple suppliers, chiefly Roma Hyman, who had already been sentenced to 26 years, and Alex Mail, who received 18. Barbosa had purchased 46 kilos of cocaine from Hyman alone in just 2 months and sourced even more from the Allison brothers and Mail. He didn't just connect the dots, he was the one drawing the map. Prosecutors outlined how Barbosa had used couriers like James Helly and Robert Dent, both already behind bars for their roles. Dent's house had functioned as a safe house. Helly handled transport. Barbosa, meanwhile, kept his name clean, at least on paper. But the decrypted messages from Enquirer, the ones uncovered during Operation Venetic, removed all ambiguity. The handle Kilo Chris wasn't just a name. It was a role. And the evidence spoke for itself. Barbosa's defense tried to soften the sentence. They pointed to his time in custody in France, his lack of direct involvement in physical dealing, and argued that he was no longer active when the network began to fall. But the judge saw it differently. The flight, the hidden communications, and the continued connections with major dealers painted the opposite picture. So the court handed down a sentence that reflected the scale of harm. 19 years. The reaction was mixed. On one hand, this was a victory for law enforcement, a clear example of what happens when encrypted tech is broken and organized crime is exposed. The Southwest Regional Organized Crime Unit had removed yet another key figure in a sprawling web of supply lines, couriers, and cash. Communities across the Southwest saw it as a long-awaited win. But here's where the conversation shifts. 19 years sounds like justice. But for someone who moved over £3 million worth of Class A drugs, who used people as shields while keeping his hands clean, it also sounds like a bargain. Barbosa wasn't a street dealer scraping by. He was a silent strategist at the top of a violent trade, one that ruins lives, fuels addiction, and drives youth exploitation. And yet, for all that, he'll be eligible for release in under 2 decades. What's worse is what this sentence might signal to others in the game. That if you're smart enough, detached enough, and don't get caught with product in your hand, you might just ride it out. That you can build an empire from the shadows and walk away with your life intact. There's no doubt the system worked in catching him. But is it keeping up with the scale of harm these men are causing? Or is it sending the message that even the masterminds still have a way out? Because in the world Barbosa came from, 19 years might feel less like punishment, and more like the cost of doing business.